Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life is produced by the Institute for Philosophy and Public Life, a division of the University of North Dakota's College of Arts and Sciences. Visit us online at whyradioshow.org.
Hi, I'm Jack Russell Weinstein, host of Why, Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. Today we welcome our guest Susan Sugarman and ask, is Freud still relevant? I read 2 books on Sigmund Freud by our guest, but the sentence that I've been thinking about the most was in the very first few paragraphs. It read, Freud calls for and proposes a psychological explanation of mental illness. Let me read that again. Freud calls for and proposes a psychological explanation of mental illness. This is a pretty low-key description for such a cataclysmic shift in human inquiry. For most of history, people thought abnormal behavior was caused by something other than the person who got sick. This could be possession by evil spirits or the physical decay from their bad morality. It could be God's punishment. Those who suffered from melancholy, what we would now call depression, were said to be infected by a black bile, a mysterious substance that needed to be purged from the blood. Hysteria, an all-encompassing condition that affected women who, not coincidentally, men couldn't control, was sometimes alleged to be the consequence of a wandering womb, whatever that means. Some of the earliest treatments for mental disorders involved drilling holes into people's skulls. Jump ahead to now, when mental illness is largely managed pharmacologically. If someone is depressed, they take pills to introduce chemicals into their bodies. If they're anxious, they treat it basically the same way as they would toenail fungus. Nervous people smoke marijuana to overcome their sexual inhibitions. Those racked by guilt get drunk to cope with bad memories. We all take a lot of sleeping pills. Modern medicine isn't bad, of course, but it's physical. It centers on our brain. Today, we'll be considering another option. When Freud seeks a psychological cause for mental illness, he is concerned with the mind, not the brain. He attends to the abstract identity that is the outcome of our neurology, not the electrochemical processes that create it. He explores human experience, our thought, understanding, and judgment. He recognizes that abnormal behavior is a response to inferences we make, only some of which we are aware of. Because I seek pleasure, I want to do this thing. Because I know I'm going to die, I want to do that thing. Because I feel guilty for being attracted to the wrong person, I manufacture physical pain in my leg. In all of these instances, the mental affects the mental. For Freud, people can be the cause of their own illness, but this also means that they can be the cure as well. I want you to take a moment to consider just how optimistic this is. We may be broken, but with help and by respecting our own agency, we can be repaired. Freudian psychoanalysis operated on the principle that talking and self-examination can be therapeutic. If this doesn't sound revolutionary to you, it's because the battle is already won. Therapy is normal because Freud made it so. I want to call attention to another aspect of the psychological revolution. For Freud, mental illness, abnormal behavior, is not distinct from who we are. Cancer is a parasite, it kills us. Depression is a veil, it hides us. Addiction is a prison, it traps us. These afflictions are presented as if they mark a radical break between how we become distorted by these sicknesses and who we really are at other times. Yet this is not the case with, say, PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder manifests itself as depression or anxiety for sure, but those are now considered symptoms, not illnesses in themselves. This is because PTSD presumes that something happened to us and sewed itself into our identity. This understanding grows out of Freud's work. Now, I don't want to go too far here. While PTSD was only officially recognized by the American Psychological Association in 1980, its ancestors had been around long before Freud. Shell shock, soldier's heart, and nostalgia were all names for a family of mental scars that always accompanied violence. My point is that post-traumatic stress disorder is a familiar example of an illness that starts with the mental response to something, interweaves conscious and unconscious elements, and then manifests itself in real physical symptoms manufactured by the mind. It exemplifies what a psychological explanation looks like. Today's guest is going to guide us through Freud's career and explain how he developed the methods and language of modern psychotherapy. She will unify his empirical case studies with his theory of human beings who behave according to consistent and understandable natural principles. She will articulate Freud's theoretical explanation of why people do what they do and why so many hurt themselves while they're doing it. The episode will include a foray into terms that are familiar to many of us: the id and ego, repression and sublimation, the pleasure principle. Freud's legacy is profound, even though it is de rigueur to treat him like an obsolete and absurd relic of the past. With this in mind, I shall ask you, my audience, to do what you always do. Treat the familiar as foreign and regard the closed case as open. What if we look at modern psychology as something new and developing? What if we wave away the cartoonish caricature of the quirky little man with the exaggerated Viennese accent who almost certainly never said, "Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar"? What if instead we rediscover how Freud was instrumental in revealing the complexity of the modern psyche, as well as the depth of how individuals manufacture the meaning and understanding of their own experiences? Freud didn't get everything right, no one ever does. But this doesn't change the fact that all of us regularly interpret our own behaviors in very Freudian ways. Sigmund Freud is a victim of his own success. He created a world that now takes him for granted. And now our guest. Susan Sugarman is professor of psychology at Princeton University. She's a trained developmental psychologist with an interest in unexplainable elements of the human experience and the intersections of psychology, philosophy, and the history of ideas. She's the author of more than a dozen books, most recently Freud, A Contemporary Introduction, published by Routledge. Susan, welcome to Why.
Thank you.
To our listeners, if you'd like to participate, please share your favorite moments from the show and tag us on social networks. Our handle is always at Why Radio Show. That's WHY Radio Show. Rate us on iTunes, Spotify, or your preferred podcast platform so that others can find the show, and listen to now 18 seasons worth of episodes for free, as well as our sister show, Philosophical Currents, at our website, whyradioshow.org. And as always, this show can only happen with your support. We exist solely on listener contributions. So click donate in the upper right-hand corner of our website to make your tax-deductible donations through the University of North Dakota Alumni Foundation portal. So, Susan, I gave a brief overview of the more dramatic approaches to abnormal behaviors before Freud. But how did the world think about mental health before Freud? Was, quote, mental health, quote, even a thing people talked about?
Not really. I would say, although we can go back as far as Kant, at least, who has one text on the maladies of the head. So people were certainly aware earlier than Freud that people could behave strangely, and certainly there are tracts even from the ancient world that attest to that. But in terms of how people with symptoms, let us say, were treated before Freud, or more exactly before Breuer, Joseph Breuer, one of Freud's mentors, as Freud puts it in his introductory text, 5 Lectures on Psychoanalysis from 1909. Before Breuer, somebody presenting with depression or more flagrant psychopathological symptoms would be largely dismissed as not treatable. And Breuer, who himself was a physician, like a few other people in Europe, tried using hypnosis to calm people down. But he did something beyond that, which is he approached his patients with sympathy. One woman, who's called Anna O in the literature, who Breuer treated shortly before Freud went to work with him, she had what was then known as hysteria. She had all different kinds of psychosomatic symptoms like paralysis on one side, twitches, and most dangerously, she was unable to drink. So no matter how thirsty she got, she simply could not take fluid and lived on fruit instead. So anyway, Breuer would visit her and as part of her disease, she would sometimes go into what he called absences, or at least that's the English translation. And in those absences, she might start to mutter things. And at one point, she started muttering about a lady companion she had had, with all kinds of disgust and distaste, and mentioned a scene in which she had come upon the lady companion whose dog was drinking from a human cup. And she said all this with evident disgust and couldn't get beyond that. But in any case, she came out of the trance begging for water and drank it. So he had the insight to realize that this episode that she described had something to do with the origination of the symptom. And that was really where it all started. And Freud picked up on that. He became a systematic theorist, but it was listening to people like that that got it started, and that was different.
In a minute, I'm going to ask you what you mean by systematic theorist, but I was taken by the term you used, psychopathology. Is this the period when we start to medicalize the mind? Is this when we start to think about the mind as something that can be healthy and unhealthy and cultivated and harmed by our own actions? Or is there a history of medicalization before this?
So that's what you're referring to as medicalization?
Yeah, this idea of pathologizing an illness. I guess I'm channeling Foucault here a little bit, but this idea that we look at behavior or we look at the psychological sources of things as something that we can isolate and treat, as opposed to something holistic or beyond our ability to focus on.
I think that was starting to develop with Breuer and Freud.
What is the central insight that makes the transition between sort of pre-Freudian, pre-Breuerian way of looking at the mind? Is it that the mind is reactive in a certain way? Is it that the mind can be distorted? What's the pivot point that allows us to think in modern psychological terms that we could identify around this time?
I think at the most basic level, it's the idea that the mind can influence behavior, and it can do that via channels within it that we're not aware of. So in this example of on O, she didn't have this episode with the governess, sorry, lady companion, front of mind. In fact, she wasn't thinking about her at all. But then there was this association when her natural, what we would now call psychological defenses, were down, and out it came. And there was a connection attested to by the circumstance that this one particular symptom that they were after, namely her inability to drink, that vanished once she made the connection to this originating incident and gave expression to the terrible affect she felt at the scene, which, and Breuer considered this important, she had actively worked to hold back out of a sense of propriety. I mean, I should provide as background to that. It's not that this was it was an isolated episode, but also this is in the context of a woman who's having lots of problems with affect being choked off or strangulated. Freud uses that word. But the pivot point, I mean, there are two coming out of that one episode. One is that there's mentation that goes on that we're not aware of. So that's the idea of unconscious thought. And the other is that sometimes very curious looking behaviors, even self-threatening ones like not being able to drink, They're not accidental. And not only are they not accidental, but they have a meaning. And they have a meaning in the particular sense that they're serving a purpose. So we can look at somebody unable to drink and see in that an absolutely life-threatening condition, making us wring our hands at, "Oh my goodness, this woman isn't gonna make it if she can't take fluid." But then it turns out that in her mental world, the not being able to drink, being choked off, is actually serving a purpose. It's protecting her from all the associated feelings and thoughts connected with the lady companion and whatever she was connected with. So it's not pointless, it's not nonsensical. She just can't make the connection herself. And I think those two insights, that there can be mentation outside of what's conscious, and that even bizarre things that people do may be issuing from a place of meaning and may have a purpose.
How all encompassing is this idea of non accidental behaviors? When people joke about Freud now and in sort of pop culture ways, we use the term Freudian slip. We imply that Freud thought every single thing we do was caused and non-accidental in some deep, often unconscious, which I'll ask you about later, unconscious way. Is that an accurate picture? Is everything we say and speak and think and feel non-accidental, or is that a perversion of what's happening here?
It is and it isn't a perversion.
My favorite kinds of perversions.
Okay, so everything we say and do and think has to come from somewhere within us. I mean, it's hard to imagine that anything comes out of us, that's just noise. It's not how we're built. So the question is not, so theoretically, I mean, if we could physically see a mind at work, which we can't, and it's not the same as the neurons and all that stuff, there would be some pathway through which whatever it is came out of us. At the same time, I think when people refer pejoratively to Freudian slips and things like that, what they're imagining is that everything has some deeply buried, highly significant meaning. And even Freud didn't mean that at all. He concluded that our behavior follows the pleasure principle, by which he simply means that anything we do, say, anything coming out of us is governed as a boundary condition by an attempt to avoid the painful or unpleasant, and where possible, an attempt to find the pleasant. Now that's not hedonistic. It's not that, we're looking for hijinks and fun and games and being Dionysus and all of that. It's just a basic operating principle. And it simply is the tool that we can use to figure out people's behavior. In other words, if we're looking at on O and we have, let's just say we're focusing on the inability to drink, what we want to ask is, why is she doing that? And whenever you ask that about anything that anyone is doing, you are relying on the pleasure principle. You are saying that whatever she's doing is serving her in some way. She may be aware of it, she may not be aware of it. It might be purely physical, it might be mental. I mean, it might be all sorts of things, but that's meant by that. So when Freud interprets slips, so that's so the usual one is when You say, I declare this meeting closed when you're banging the gavel and trying to open the meeting. Yes, it's possible that could mean that you would wish you were closing it and that it was all over with and you didn't have to run it. But it doesn't necessarily mean that. It could just be a clang association. It could just be anticipating something else. Sometimes we make slips because we get two words sound very similar and we pick the wrong one. I mean, Freud says in his book, Psychopathology of Everyday Life, where he talks about Freudian slips and mislaying things, tip of the tongue phenomenon, not being able to remember a name you know well, that all of those could have some interesting significance or they could not. He says that in the beginning of his text. By the time he reaches the end, he seems to have concluded that from the point of view of trying to understand people, especially people with problems who you are treating, it's in general a really good idea to pick up on any small error like that, just on the chance that if you pursue it with the patient, you might get to some interesting territory. So when you say, if a patient makes a slip and pulls out the wrong word in trying to talk about something, I mean, why not just go for it and see if something else was sitting there in the mind that wasn't coming out? Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't.
This is a really interesting thread to pull. We have to take a break. When we come back, I'm going to want to obviously visit with the pleasure principle, what that means. I want to ask you about the unconscious and what it means to be a systemic thinker. And I want to talk about this notion of Freud and psychoanalysis as exploratory. But before that, we have to take a break. You're listening to Susan Sugarman and Jack Russell Weinstein on Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. We'll be back right after this.
The Institute for Philosophy and Public Life bridges the gap between academic philosophy and the general public. Its mission is to cultivate discussion between philosophy professionals and others who have an interest in the subject, regardless of experience or credentials. Visit us on the web at philosophyandpubliclife.org. The Institute for Philosophy and Public Life, because there is no ivory tower.
We are back with Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. I'm your host, Jack Russell Weinstein. I'm talking to Susan Sugarman about Sigmund Freud. And one of the questions that I have is how to approach Freud, because I read two of her books, What Freud Really Meant and Sigmund Freud, A Contemporary Introduction, and they take different approaches. One is very evolutionary. We watch Freud figure stuff out. And one is sort of an overview. And so I'm curious about what the best way is to talk about Freud and whether we should treat him as a finished thinker who came up with a theory or someone who is messing about. But before we get to that, I want to ask a different question. And I keep thinking about this joke. It's an old joke that was a stand-up comic. I can't remember, in the 80s or something. And this guy says, yesterday at dinner, I made the classic Freudian slip. I meant to say, please pass the salt, but what I really said, Dad, you prick, you ruined my childhood. And the implication of that joke is that we are consumed by our frustrations and our pain and our past, and it's constantly trying to get out. And that when we let go, we are determined by our past. So the question I want to ask you, Susan, is, first of all, does Freud think that we are consumed by the badness that we suffer? But also, to what extent does Freud understand our future is determined by our past? Are we creatures that are following a script, or are we free creatures that are free to create meaning, significance, and we can find health by redefining things?
To start with your second question, and you may need to remind me of the first, um,
Sure.
if Freud thought that we were completely determined by our past, I don't think he would have practiced, invented, or practiced the system of psychotherapy called psychoanalysis. In other words, you go into treatment with the understanding that you may be able to improve things for yourself to the extent that they're bad. So, no, the past is not totally determinative of where we're going. It explains a lot about us, perhaps, but the whole idea of excavating it, as you do in psychoanalysis, is to get free of it, or as free of it as one can be or wants to be.
When people talk about Freud, is there a finished Freud that they describe? You earlier you used the word systemic. Is there a point where, sort of, for Freud scholars, Freud becomes Freud and everything else is anticipatory? Or do people, is it better to talk about Freud as someone who's figuring out the project as he goes, and inventing a new language of psychotherapy, and trying this and adjusting that? How genealogically should we approach Freud?
I would say very genealogically, but I want to say before that that I can only speak for myself and not for other scholars and not the conventional person, whoever that may be. And one of the reasons I want to stress that is that one problem we have with the received Freud, both in, among the populace as well as among the scholarly and clinical community, is that people don't read him. Everything is kind of second or third hand, and that circulates, and then it gets worse. He's seriously misread. And, for example, the pleasure principle being understood as a form of hedonism, say. It's not, it's not an explanation of behavior. It's a first principle, which means it's a place you start from. Anyway, putting that aside, he kept revising his theory throughout his career. I mean, once he started having a theory. So there isn't really a finished Freud. There are the last few texts and what the picture is that emerges. But one thing that's true of him is that although as he went along, he felt the need based on his observations and his experiences treating people and looking around at social structure, society, and all of that, although he changed, what actually emerges is, in fact, a theory that's growing in concentric circles. So he starts, I mean, we can get into this in a bit, but he starts with enunciating the pleasure principle and a slight modification of it, and then he throws other ingredients into the theory, like if we're little engines that operate on the pleasure principle, and as we grow, we try to take reality into account, what is it that really sets us off? So then he comes to this idea, what the main translator of his work, James Strachey, would call instincts. Other translators like to use the word drives, but they're sort of inborn pushes that we have that date all the way back to the beginning of life biologically. So that would be sex or reproduction and survival. So the idea is that those are pushes that will set the pleasure principle into motion. So he's not, in introducing those terms, or much later, id, ego, superego, life and death principles, aggression, and all of that, he's building an edifice more than throwing stuff out and saying something new, although he did walk back certain assumptions, like the idea that the pleasure principle explains everything.
So I want to interrupt for a second because I want to ask two questions. First, can you explain the pleasure principle? And is it just, you said it's not hedonistic. So how is it different than just we are trying to get as much pleasure as possible? We're trying to avoid pain. We're trying to get pleasure. But second, when he talks about pleasure and sexuality and reproduction, is it the kind of thing that we're familiar with when evolutionary biologists say the species is wired for reproduction and therefore sexual activity is part of our collective necessary drive? Is he talking about pleasure and sex in that large scale way, or is pleasure and human sexuality much more individualistic and much more explanatory on the micro level rather than the macro level?
Okay, so it's basically what you get from John Stuart Mill, who's a bit earlier, who enunciated a happiness principle and, like Freud, is misunderstood to have said it's all about pleasure. It isn't. It's that our behavior in general, there are reasons for it. That's all. It's not that we're out there trying to have a good time. I mean, yeah, sure, sometimes we are, but mostly what we're doing, it's again, if you think of yourself watching someone else or reading about someone else and you're prompted to ask why, why did that person do that? You know, what was he or she thinking? You're saying that our behavior is guided by something that serves us in some way. I mean, I'm trying to make it sound as general and uncontroversial as possible. It's just to say that this is the boundary. I mean, Freud goes further with that and says things like when we're born, you know, when really tiny, most of our behavior is simply driven by what feels good, what doesn't feel good, and then you act accordingly. And sometimes, you know, as we're going along, I mean, that's only going to get us so far because you might walk right into danger that's not good. So you have to kind of pay attention to the consequences of your behavior. I mean, once you're old enough, a few months old, to start paying attention to the outcome of what you do. So you might observe that every time you squawk, you know, one of your wonderful parents comes by, assuming you understand them, you know, as your caregivers by that point. Now it's like seeing what works. And Freud is just trying to say, as Mills said before him, that that's why we do things, even when we do things that look indifferent or even painful. Presumably, we're doing them because they serve some purpose or other. And that says nothing about whether we're well advised or ill advised in doing whatever we do.
This is really interesting because as I was reading the books, I'll tell you the question that was in my head, but then I'll explain it for the audience, et cetera. I kept asking myself, is Freud of the 18th or 19th century? And what I meant by that was in the 18th century, a lot of the philosophers who engaged in moral psychology were interested in what David Hume called the science of man. They were trying to explain human behavior by these first principles, by these drives. And there was selfishness, and there was empathy, and there was the desire for connection, and all these sorts of things. And there was this. It's where sociology and anthropology are developed. And then the 19th century, different things are going on. There's professionalizations of the disciplines, and there's this sense of idealism of the reality of abstract thought and stuff we don't have to get into. Mill, of course, is much more of a materialist. And I guess the question I want to ask is, first, When you're talking about, or when Freud is talking about these principles and these drives and these instincts, is it that he's trying to create a natural theory of human behavior? Is he trying to give us a moderately predictive, scientific explanation of something that hasn't been explained before? And if so, do all human beings follow the same basic principles? Is it the human that he's describing as opposed to Fred and Sally? And one of the reasons why I ask that is that, again, the sort of the received Freud that people talk about in the culture, people often talk about Freud as not understanding women and being very, very critical. And there have been a lot of feminist theorists who objected to him. But there was nothing in your writing that gave a hint that there were any different operating principles for men and women. So to what extent is he trying to create a naturalistic science of human behavior that describes the human experience? And to what extent is all of this individualizable and different for each person?
I think it's important in addressing that question to draw a distinction between this general theory of his, starting with the pleasure principle and integrating drives and whatnot, and the clinician. Because if he were someone who was operating with just these really broad principles and someone walked into his office, he wouldn't be able to do a thing, how's your pleasure principle today? You know, so that general theory is kind of extrapolated from what he does and what he sees, but certainly it's very individualistic because he couldn't treat people otherwise, trying to work with them to get out what they may be trying, what they might be squelching down and so forth. And that's going to be different for everyone. But I want to go back and address another general point that you raised, which is that Freud Freud's theory isn't so much, let's come up with a natural theory of the human. It's that Freud is at heart and at bottom a developmental theorist. So the whole reason for distinguishing, say, sex/reproduction versus survival is that he wants to anchor his account in something that's biologically valid in the sense that it goes all the way back to very simple life. Okay, so anything that's alive has to reproduce somehow, and it has to survive. And if you go back in the plant world and in the animal world, you see that. And interestingly, since you just asked which century he's from, you'll get that distinction in Aristotle, right? I mean,
Right.
starting
The
with him.
vegetative. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and so for Freud, it's very important to have everything aligned with where we came from. Otherwise it's coming from nowhere. So that's why there's such an emphasis on these very basic principles. And eventually he's going to get human sexuality out of, this reproduction slash sexual push. But by the time he works that up into humans, it's much, much broader than sex per se. And as far as the difference between men and women is concerned, I mean, yes, there's the fact that he often uses the male as his model for whatever he's looking at because he knows it better, I suppose, not because it's dominant. And Freud on sexuality is a whole other topic, but you really have to read him to see where he's going with the difference between the sexes. I mean, because some of his thought comes from the understanding that women have a more complicated development. And different things happen because of that. But he's certainly not down on women. I mean, if you read the whole corpus, that's very clear. I mean, if you look at the rest of his life, he was very much a champion of women's rights. He thought women should have the vote. He translated Mills on the subjection of women into German. I mean, well, anyway, that's a tributary that I think is kind of off what we're talking about right now. But the point is, again, this biological anchor. It isn't to say that everything we are is sex and survival or later sex and aggression and all of that. It's that he has to anchor the theory in primitives that go all the way back biologically.
So we have this biologically rooted psychological theory that has to be consistent with what we know about the species and what we know about development and what we know about science and history and all these sorts of things. And then we have the individual people. So let's talk for a second about Freud, the clinician. We use, when we talk about Freud, and used in the book, the phrase psychoanalysis. But of course, we tend not to use psychoanalysis today in our language. We use the word therapy. Sometimes we use the word counseling, but we use the word therapy. And I know someone who actually went to a Freudian psychiatrist, and her experience was very, very different. Can you talk about what psychoanalysis is, what the method of psychoanalysis is, and how we should distinguish the Freudian method of psychoanalysis from the sort of everyday therapist that most of us will encounter?
Okay, that's a very fair question. So non-psychoanalytic psychotherapy grew up after Freud. I mean, I think this was either said or implied by you in some of your earlier comments that Freud birthed initially with Breuer, but Freud birthed the idea of trying to help people by looking at their minds. In the initial instance, all psychoanalysis means is treating people by looking at their minds. It gets to be more specific than that because Freud was finding was that often in treatment, it required going back to earlier pieces of a patient's life to understand why the patient reacted as he or she did in the contemporary moment. And to say that it was necessary to go back is to say that the symptoms didn't dissipate until that work was done. Psychoanalysis I mean, you asked this question in all fairness. Psychoanalysis involves having patients explore their own minds. I mean, you don't walk in as a patient and then have somebody say to you, okay, what happened to you when you were 3? It's patients just start wherever. And you don't ask the patient for anything in particular. You just say the patient walks in and wants to talk about what happened at work that day. Well, then you start to push a little and say, okay, and what does that remind you of? And the patient answers, okay, and does that bring anything else to mind? I mean, this is a technique of free association where you take whatever the patient is giving and prod the patient to explore a little further on the assumption that whatever is troubling the patient may go back beyond whatever is front of mind in the patient's life right now. So there's that technique of exploration, but at a more abstract level, it's the idea of talking to the patient about his or her life and being an empathetic listener, prodding for a little bit more, sometimes just echoing what you hear.
This vision of the person on the couch, the psychiatrist sort of somewhat behind them, the patient just talking, Is this about the person getting rid of all distractions and becoming as internal as possible? There's almost a mysticism when people talk about Freudian psychoanalysis, but it sounds like this is actually quite practical and strategic, that the goal is to get someone to feel non-judged and self-interested in the literal sense of the term and self-focused so that then the psychiatrist and the patient can work together to pull these threads and find, well, this reminds you of this reminds you of that, this reminds you of that, that it's really just about creating an environment that is conducive to internal reflection. Is that fair?
I think that's quite fair. There are some passages towards the beginning of the interpretation of dreams, which is one of Freud's first works that becomes more general theoretical. But he makes clear in there, whether you're trying to get some use out of a dream that a patient had, or whether you're talking about how a patient reacted to bumping into a colleague in the street. You want the patient as relaxed as possible, and in particular, not editing his or her thought. So, like, if something comes to mind, the idea is you have to spill it, regardless of, how offensive it might seem, how boring, how silly, because it's only by sort of dumping out everything's that's there that you start to get a picture of what's going on inside, but also it's partly an unburdening as well. So, yes, definitely practical, not mystical in the least. I mean, if you have the blinds up and the sun's streaming in and you're staring the patient in the face, that's more likely to produce some kind of vigilance in the person. I mean, on the other hand, nowadays, even people who do some form of talking therapy, even people who do psychoanalysis, you don't have to be lying on the couch with the blinds drawn and things dark and all of that. You just have to be making the environment comfortable. And you're right, eliminating distraction. And I think some practitioners do that by just sitting there and looking empathetically at the patient.
There's something about the old model that makes me think that the psychiatrist might get in trouble with HR. that there's something more conducive to sketchiness. But I want to ask this because I want to move to the structure of the mind a little bit and talk a little bit about the id and the ego and the superego. But before that, I want to ask about the subconscious. How radical was this idea of a subconscious, of a collection of thoughts and beliefs and meanings and connections that people were not aware that they had, but were still influencing their behavior? And would the existence of a conscious and a subconscious bifurcate the mind in certain ways? Does it suggest that there's a disconnected mind because there's so much we don't know what's going on? So what does the subconscious do? How radical of a suggestion was it? And what does it tell us about the unity of human identity?
At
It's a
least
huge
in
question, I know.
Yeah, no, 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 I'm just gonna alter it a little bit because at least in English translation, I mean, and coming directly from the German, Freud would refer to unconscious, not
Right, yes,
subconscious.
sorry, my yes, right.
Okay,
My mistake, yes.
just to make sure we're talking about the same thing.
Yes, the unconscious,
Um,
yes.
well, I mean, you can look back and find traces. I mean, if you look at Spinoza, say, who's a lot earlier than Freud, you have the idea that, except when we're kind of walking through a logical syllogism or something like that, the stuff we come out with, I mean, even just our own thoughts, but whatever we think or do goes back almost indefinitely to all sorts of causes, many of which, or most of which, we're not aware of. I mean, he didn't remotely do anything like a bifurcation. He just said, this was his idea of, this is philosophy speak, but so-called inadequately caused behavior. Where do you get your preference for novels that have mermaids in them or something like that? You dig back and dig back and dig back, ultimately to the thing that came before mermaids struck your fancy, if you really wanted to explain that. And of course, nobody wants that total explanation. So that idea isn't new with Freud, although from what I can tell, and I'm not the philosopher you are, I don't know how much idea was picked up after Spinoza. So in any case, there's something about it that's not new, and Freud recognized this and, somewhere or other pays his debts. But the idea of a bifurcation, I mean, from his paper on the unconscious, the 1915 one, he says that just for expository convenience, let's divide consciousness, what you're aware of right now, which is not very much, then pre-conscious, which is all that stuff that's sitting in your mind, like what you had for breakfast this morning, which until I mentioned it just now, you probably weren't thinking about, but you can call it up very easily. And then there's stuff that's unconscious that you just can't get out by simply asking it to come forth. So there is a kind of barrier there, but it's a dynamic barrier. It's that some experiences, generally pretty early ones, that were painful or that set us into some kind of conflict, say we got really, really angry at a parent who we otherwise adored and loved and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, it's hard to sustain your anger when you let the positive feelings float back in. So we kind of squash some stuff down, or as Freud says in the early works, we withdraw consciousness from it, like withdrawing your hand from a hot stove, and that's repression. So there is this idea, this dynamic idea that we have contents in our minds, thoughts, feelings, memories, impressions, that we could only get to if we were able to work through, all our efforts to sit on whatever it is. And those are not necessarily conscious either. In fact, they're almost certainly not conscious. So that's why it's so hard to get back. So I wouldn't say bifurcated. You have to think more in process terms or dynamic terms, that, kind of content by content. We sit on some stuff, and it takes work to let go of the defenses that are holding it back to let it come out.
So with that said, when we talk about the id, the ego, the superego, as I understand, and please correct me, the id is this emotional, sometimes portrayed as aggressive element of ourselves. The Hulk has been described as, all id, and ego is our self-focused, self-interested aspect, and then the superego is the judgmental, evaluative self. So first of all, correct me where I got that wrong. But second of all, those three things, they're analytic categories then. He's not suggesting, as some cognitive scientists suggest, that this part of the brain is the id and this part of the brain, is love, and this part of the brain is anger, etc. Are the id and superego analytic, or as you use the word, expository ideas, or are they more real and more distinct than that?
In terms of the categories themselves, Freud is pretty clear, especially in the text, The Ego and the Id, where he first officially announces them, although some of the ideas have been kicking around in his writings for, say, the decade before that. So for him, they're more types of things that are in our minds. They're not regions. I mean, not even figuratively are they regions, even though he uses a little diagram in his book to show them. I mean, it's just a spatial representation of something that isn't spatial at all, quite apart from how it may or may not translate into neural structures we know about. So there is a danger with the terms that they get reified. They're made into things, my id, my ego, my superego. But in fact, they're just strands of mental content, I guess, and it's all dynamically explained. I think maybe it might help to pause and look at why Freud came up with that typology, if that's okay.
Sure.
So before that, in order to portray the dynamic of something like repressing something, in other words, kicking it out of consciousness and erecting a gate that makes it hard for the thing to come back and hard for you to find it. He just spoke about what was unconscious, preconscious, or conscious. And for all intents and purposes, we can just lump conscious and preconscious together as, the category of stuff that you can get at easily. He had trouble with that because in trying to pull apart something like a neurosis, say, as I implied in my comments maybe about 10 or 15 minutes ago. So we're capable of pushing content out of consciousness, especially when we're little and don't reason about it so much. We just want to get away from it. Well, it takes sort of two things going on in order to do that. I mean, one is there's the content, which we don't like and want to get rid of. And then there are the ideas and feelings that are making us want to get rid of it and keep it out of the way. And on the basis of what he saw in the clinic, those processes are not terribly conscious either. In other words, we're working really hard all the time to keep back experiences we didn't resolve, that were hard for us, but nonetheless, reflected some impulse or other that we had. So if the thing that's being pushed out of consciousness and the force that's doing the pushing are both unconscious, then dividing the mind into conscious and unconscious isn't going to help you. And that's, at least, by his self-report, what eventuated in the terms id ego for the first division. So id he just used to refer to raw impulse, but more importantly, all the stuff that we've repressed that's still down there somewhere waiting for an opportunity to express itself. And then there's ego, which is the reasoning, judging part, also the part that connects to the outside world, it perceives, and so on. Basically what we consciously think of as me, but me is really the whole business. It's just the reasoning, guiding, remembering ideas concerned with safety and whatnot, rather than just I want, or here comes the anger blasting out. Superego comes about in a completely different way. And I think you characterized it appropriately when you said it's the judging part. Some people get confused and say that's the morality part, and that's really not right. It's the fact that we watch ourselves and, feel like we're running the risk of doing the wrong thing a lot. We can really beat up on ourselves, and all that's about superego. And it doesn't matter so much why we're doing that. Did we break a commandment? Did we break a convention? I mean, what did we do? It's not that. It's just that we're capable of watching and judging and squashing self.
This makes a lot of sense to me, because if the discussion is about how people react and respond to themselves, then you have to divide the self analytically to distinguish between, at minimum, the cause and effect, right? I mean, you have to have some sort of structure to map the intentionality of all of this. And so this is actually very helpful for me to hear this as a way of organizing and conceptualizing, thinking about the unconscious. There are two questions I need to ask before we go. The second is going to be, I'll tell you in advance what Freud might think of our world of therapy now. But the question I want to ask before goes back to this discussion of how Freud is talked about in pop culture. And you mentioned that Freud on sexuality is a whole other thing, and I certainly don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole. But when people talk about Freud and make fun of Freud, they are obsessed with not just his theory of sexuality, but all sorts of very male-centric, penis-centric visions. And again, something else that's floating in my head is there's an episode of Friends where one of the characters, Joey, is in a musical on Freud's life, and he sings a song that says, "All I want is a winky," right? "All I need is a schlong," I think is what he says. And the question isn't whether that's right or not, because I'm sure it's not. The question is, that picture of Freud, was that intentionally constructed to undermine him? Did people take his theory of sexuality and try to distort it because it was threatening, because it was against contemporary mores, because they didn't like his school of thought? Or is that just culture in action, the evolution of memes? Why is Freud portrayed so silly? Is that an attempt to undermine and disarm his power? Or is that just, as you pointed out before, people read third hand the things that he said?
I think it's the latter. I mean, again, you'd have to ask a real historian about this,
Mm.
but I don't see that other layer of intention that you're depicting, that people just wanted to undermine him because he was saying things that they thought were crazy and destructive and all of that. I think he quickly became handed down second hand, third hand, fourth hand, and all of that. And these visions of his theory tend to distort what the different components are doing in there. I mean, he had a reason for emphasizing sexuality. I mean, one was this sort of, going back and making it consistent with where we come from evolutionarily, biologically. But the other thing is, and he says this outright, that he had no reason a priori for believing that the things that were driving patients to become neurotic would be anchored in sexuality, or for that matter, early sexuality. But in fact, he found repeatedly that it was going back both to the early life and to what we might broadly call sexuality, erotic relations, at the very least, that seemed to figure in what was bothering them in their current lives. So it is to some extent blown out of proportion, but then again, it isn't. I mean, it's what he found.
So I guess the question that I have then is, does Freud ever address the cultural context? And what I mean by that is, when he says people are going back to these sexual desires, how much of the manifestation of the repressions and the neuroses and just the meaning is culture bound, Vienna, Victorian culture, late 19th, early 20th century stuff? And how much is the focus on sex itself culture bound? Does he address the sort of, again, caricaturish objection that Freud talks about sex all the time because he comes from a sexually repressed culture, and of course that messed people up. How does he address the culture in which he does his clinical work?
He does address it. There's a fairly early paper of his called Civilized Sexual Morality, where he hits some of the points that you're hitting about how both men and women, but especially women, are really suppressed by the culture around them, and that given that our, erotic sexual impulsions are natural and all that, along with all sorts of other impulsions, that creates a difficult and ultimately unhealthy mental environment for us. And then, he hits those points again in his later work, Civilization and Its Discontents, showing that if you cut off what's a natural impulsion, we're going to pay for it. And Nietzsche said the same thing. So, but then as to why sexuality gets stressed as much as it does, I mean, that could just be the culture that's perceiving Freud. I just think people see more there than really is there in his worldview and in his writings. But again, I think one has to remember that he went in that direction in good part because of what he saw. And it's not because of what he saw, looking at the world in general. It's because of what he was dealing with as a practitioner.
So with that said, the last question, and you're not a soothsayer, and I'm not asking for a definitive answer, but what do you think Freud's assessment would be of the current therapeutic environment where, first of all, as I talked about in the beginning, there's a lot of pharmacological treatment, but also so many of the therapists that I have seen are cognitive behaviorists, and they're really interested in how do you manage the feelings that you have, and how do you tamp down this stuff so that you're not reactive or self-destructive or things like that. And I know obviously that there are different schools of thought, but what do you think Freud might say about the therapeutic landscape that we inhabit right now?
I think he might be glad to see that mental illness is being taken seriously, at least in some sectors, and that there still is such a thing as talk therapy. Some of it goes deep, some of it doesn't. As for cognitive behavioral therapy, there are kind of two things to look at. One is that if your symptoms make it totally impossible for you to function or even sit down and talk to a therapist, there might be some point to trying to just rein in the symptoms a little bit so that you can start to go to work. And I mean, there are different species of cognitive behavioral therapy. There's, sort of the reframing type of cognitive behavioral therapy where you try to help somebody look at something from a different vantage point. And there's also something like systematic desensitization, which would be used especially with obsessive compulsive disorder. So if you have a compulsive hand washer, say somebody who just can't leave the bathroom until the person has washed, say, 15 times, and if it's any less, there's a problem, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, if you're Freud, you might look at that, you might see it as maladaptive, and at some level the patient knows that this shouldn't be necessary, but it is. So Freud would say anything like that, where the ultimate cause is mysterious, because if immediate reasoning is that, I'm going to pick up germs if I don't get, under that corner of that fingernail and so on and so forth, that it still doesn't fit. It's out of proportion. So Freud there would suspect, okay, so there's something compulsive going on here. And if there's something compulsive going on here, then there may be some kind of unconscious conflict pushing on it and making it come out that way, which is why you can't get rid of it. But as we know, if you're doing systematic desensitization, which wasn't there in Freud's time, what you might do with your compulsive hand washer is just make an agreement and say, okay, next time you're in the bathroom, you're going to wash 12 times and no more, and you're going to leave no matter what you're telling yourself about how urgent it is that you stay. Okay, and then, gradually you feather it down to 10 times and so on. And as I had it from somebody I talked to once who was a cognitive behavioral therapist, you keep going until they'll go to the bathroom in the subway station and wash once and come out. So you can get quite far that way. I think if you're Freud, you would imagine that either you have to keep working at that process to keep the symptoms from coming back, but more or less, I think he would say that if what's really going on is that this is an adaptation to something that happened long ago, it might be best to get that out and free up whatever may be driving this. I mean, or at least that would be the thinking. And I was told by this same cognitive behavioral practitioner that, in fact, some analysts will send their patients with obsessive compulsive disorder to a cognitive behavioral therapist to get the symptoms at least a bit under control first.
Well, this has been fascinating, and it's been particularly interesting to me because I think I read Civilization and Its Discontents 15, 20 years ago, and there are aspects of it that really stuck with me, and I had very little to ground it. And then, of course, as we've talked about, the academic and intellectual culture pushes away Freud and rolls their eyes and things like that. And so this process of preparing for the show and talking to you has been really helpful for me in particular to understand Freud, the context, and his contributions. So, Susan, thank you so much for joining us on Why.
You're welcome. I'm honored to be part of it, and I enjoyed it too.
You have been listening to Susan Sugarman and Jack Russell Weinstein on Why, Philosophical Discussions about Everyday Life, and I'll be back with a few more thoughts right after this.
Visit IPPL's blog, PQED, Philosophical Questions Every Day, for more philosophical discussions of everyday life. Comment on the entries and share your points of view with an ever-growing community of professional and amateur philosophers. You can access the blog and view more information on our schedule, our broadcasts, and the Y Radio store at www.philosophyandpubliclife.org.
You're back with Why, Philosophical Discussions about Everyday Life. I'm your host, Jack Russell Weinstein. We were talking with Susan Sugarman about Freud, his theory, the reception of his theory, and how to think about it all. Philosophers like to ask why. It's the name of the show, right? And one of the great questions of the history of philosophy is, why do people behave the way that they behave? And this involves having one foot in the universal, one foot in the human species, in the way that the human animal interacts with the air and the sky, and etc. And one foot in the individual. Why Sally? Why Ben? Why Muhammad? Why Juan does certain things? And this leads us to psychology. The line between philosophy and psychology has always been very, very thin. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, it was very hard to distinguish between those two things. As psychology developed in the 19th century, as a profession, along with lots of other disciplines like history and anthropology, economics, psychology became clinical and empirical and about individual experience, which then led to the need to help people heal. The recognition that people can be mentally ill and that they can heal themselves is profoundly important, and that's where Freud comes in. I have talked endlessly in this episode about the pop culture attitude towards Freud, but I think it's important to recognize that Freud gave us something tremendously important and useful, and that is the tools to explore ourselves to improve our mental well-being. And he did that in a systematic way, meaning he did that by connecting the individual to the universal, by connecting you to the species, you to the environment. The world does damage to us. We do damage to ourselves. Mental damage is at least as important as physical damage. Going back to the origin of the modern discussion of how to fix that can't be undervalued. I think it's really time for us to push away the caricatures of Freud and look back at his central insights that there is a psychological explanation for our behavior, and that when we attend to the psychology, if we look at the unconscious, if we look at the meaning, if we look at all of these other things, we can get a better grasp of our behavior and maybe change ourselves for the better. Because I don't know about you, I can use all the help I can get. You've been listening to Jack Russell Weinstein on Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. Thank you for listening. As always, it's an honor to be with you.
Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life is a monthly radio show on Prairie Public Radio, part of the National Public Radio Network. Why Radio is a production of the University of North Dakota's Institute for Philosophy and Public Life. It's broadcast on the second Sunday of every month, and an extended version with more than 30 minutes of extra discussion is available for free as a podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and other podcast services. Please rate and review us and share us with your friends. Follow us on the usual social networks. Our handle is always at Y Radio Show. That's at WHY Radio Show. Instagram is our most active platform. Our free archive with close to 2 decades worth of episodes is available on our website, yradioshow.org. Visit to learn more about us, our sister show, Philosophical Currents, and IPPL's other projects. Please go to yradioshow.org to make your tax-deductible donation via UND's Alumni Association. Click on the blue donate button in the upper right-hand corner. Jack Russell Weinstein is our host. Teante Calloway is our engineer and editor. Y's music is written and performed by Mark Weinstein and can be found on his album Lua y Sol. For more of his music, visit jazzfluteweinstein.com. Why Radio is copyright Jack Russell Weinstein and funded as a partnership of the Institute for Philosophy and Public Life and Prairie Public Broadcasting. IPPL is an academic unit of the University of North Dakota College of Arts and Sciences. Philosophy is everywhere you make it, and we hope we have inspired you with our discussion today. Remember, as we say at the Institute, there is no ivory tower.